In a quiet part of the animal shelter, a sod cat named Charlie kept crying because he missed his owner. His family, heartbroken, had left him there not knowing how much he was suffering at night one day. Dr. White was checking Charlie and saw something strange. On his collar, he looked closer to read the Tagagan, his eyes growing wide. "Oh my God," Hess said softly, quickly calling his assistant. Emma rushed in. "What's wrong, Dr. White?" she asked, looking from him to Charlie still curled up in the corner. "Yeah, it's just, are you sure the woman who brought him said his last name?" "Was Carter?" Scott asked. Emma frowned. "Yeah, she said her name was Grace and his was Francis." Why? Scott hesitated because the thesis is not on the tag. Charlie had been inconsolable since arriving at Theshelturgers. Carter, the widow of his late owner, had brought him in, saying he only ever listened to Francis. The family struggled to care for him and had no choice but to leave him. "If we will come back to get him," Grace had said, dabbing a waiters. Scott placed Charlie in a kennel, watching as the cat curled up against the wall, still crying softly. Thou grief in animals wasn't uncommon. Charlie's sorrow was deeper than any Scott had seen before. "I'm going to see Charlie," Scott told Emma later. Still thinking about the strange feeling he had, he found Charlie in his kennel, covering his face with his paws. As Scott knelt down, he saw Thekalar still around. "Charlie's neck, it's time to take that off," he said, soft liar reaching out. But Charlie jumping away and hissing. Scott froze, hands in the air, startled by the reaction. "Why won't you let me take off your collar?" he wondered aloud. He had caught a glimpse of the tag and felt a wave of confusion. "I must have seen it wrong," he told himself. "Boot something felt off." Scott inched closer, voice soft. "Hey, Charlie, it's okay," he whispered, extending a hand carefully. Charlie's eyes narrowed, and with a swiftness he swiped at Scott, claws barely missing, realizing force wouldn't work. Scott backed away, frustrated but determined. Scott left the kennel, considering a new approach. Charlie wasn't just grieving, he was guarding something. A few minutes later, Scott returned with a treat and a toilet entry. "This again, buddy," he said, gently placing the treat near the Intransibori. Stepping back, Charlie hesitated, watching Scott, but eventually inched forward, sniffing beef for taking the treat. Scott remained still, a small smile forming. This was a step forward as Charlie chewed. Scott spoke gently, telling stories about his own pets. Little by little, Charlie relaxed, his booty less tense. Scott tried again, this time with more determination. Charlie was still cautious, but their connection was getting stronger. Using another treat, Scott encouraged Charlie to lift his head just enough to reveal the tag. His heart skipped a beat. "Oh my God," he whispered. The name engraved on the metal wasn't what he expected. It was a revelation that changed everything. "Emma, could you come here, please?" he called, urgency in his voice. His rushed in, sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes darting between Scott and Charlie. Scott pointed at the collar. "Whatever was written there was about tottering everything upside down," Scott was trying to put together. A mystery that only seemed to grow more complicated every new piece of information raised more questions than answers. "Emma, do you know Grace's full name? And are we sure their last name was Carter?" His questions came quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. Emma looked surprised, confusion written all over her face. "I'll have to check the paperwork." "Why, what's wrong?" she asked, sensing Scott's urgency. "That name isn't on the tag." Scott traplied, his voice a mix of doubt and concern. Emma's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Not on the tag, then?" Who paused, suddenly understanding what it could mean. "I'll check right now," she said quickly, turning to Olive. Scott refocused on the tag, trying to make out the name etched into the-worn metal. It was like trying to read something scratched into an old-school desk, faint and nearly impossible. Todas of Ferchiles. Constant shifting for Trets wasn't helping either, making it even harder to get a clear view. Frustration was setting in. It felt as though Thekalar held the key to everything, yet it refused to reveal its secret. Emma returned, holding a folder. "Yes, they're definitely Carter's Grace, Elizabeth Carter Mason, and Francis Antonius Carter." Chiconford. Scott's mind reeled. If that was true, then why didn't the name on Thedig match? It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole nothing made sense. He looked at Charlie, who was curled up protectively around his Colaras. If it were his most prized possession, it was clear that taking it away would only distress him further. Scott sighed and decided to leave it alone. closing Charlie's cage carefully, but his mind wasn't ready to drop the matter. He needed answers back at his desk. He took out Charlie's records and began looking through them. Every past visit to the clinic, every little note, each detail was a clue, bringing him closer to the truth-own thing. Stood out, Charlie had been a patient for 6 years. But he was clearly older than that. He had to be at least 10. Where had he been before Woe had cared for him, and why was his name scratched out on the tag? The next logical step was to visit the Carter Cedrus. Maybe they had the missing piece off the puzzle before heading out. Scott Stupido. Inform Emma and Yara. I'm stepping out for a bit, he told them. Call me if anything comes up. They nodded, used to his sudden investigative urges settling into Hisker. He punched Grace's address into the GPs. The caller's mystery nagged at him, refusing to leave his thoughts as Decker hummed to life his mind. Filled with theories, what if Charlie had been part of something bigger? What if the name on the caller had been erased? For Arison, sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with Thestery, I kindly ask you to like the video. Subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. Pressed the accelerator, his curiosity pushing him forward. When he finally reached the Carter mansion, the enormous house towered before him its silence. Almost unsettling, Scott parked the car and got out, his heart beating a little faster. Ash walked toward the heavy front door. Hack docked firmly and waited after. A moment the door creaked open, revealing a woman, someone clearly not. Gracie, I'm here about Charlie, Grace's cat. I really need to talk to her. Scott said, hoping she wouldn't find his request too strange. The woman gave him a curious look before responding. Oh, Mom's not here right now, she said, then added, but maybe I can help. Scott hesitated for a moment. Hadn't expected this, but decided to take the chance. Would you mind if I looked at some old family photo albums made from around 6 years ago? For something about Charlie, Jane blinked at the request. Boudadont seemed bothered. Sure, that's a bit unusual, but let's see what we can find, she said, stepping aside to let him in. As Jane disappeared upstairs to find albums, Scott stood in the grand entryway, taking in the house's opulent details. Everything about this place spoke of history and wealth, but to Scott it also seemed to whisper secrets. High size drifted to an oil painting on Thruel. A formal portrait of Francis Carter Thruel was something about the way he was painted, almost as if his eyes were following him. Then another photo drew Scott's attention. It was Grace and Francis smiling warmly with Charlie sitting between them. The cat looked utterly content in their embrace, and Thier around his neck was the very same collar. Scott leaned in, narrowing high size. The letters on the tag were clearer in the photograph than they had been in real life. He tried to make them out. His pulse quickened. The letters didn't match Grace or Francis. The realization sent a fresh wave of confusion through him. Who had Charlie really belonged to before Heckled process it fully? Jane's footsteps hoed down the stairs, breaking silence. Jane clutched a book tight, littering too. Scott, with a mix of curiosity and Donchik. Why are you so interested in that picture, Shisked? Scott hesitated, debating how much should reveal. He considered making something up, but decided to be honest instead. I'm really caught up in Charlie's story, especially after Francis Best, he admitted. Jane's expression softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. My dad found Charlie. After he washed it by a car, he was so scared it took a long time to calm him down, she said, her voice filled with nostalgia. Listened closely. Why didn't Francis take him to a vet? Oh, he tried. But Charlie panicked every time he got near a car. He'd just run off and hide. It was easier to care for him at home. Jane then added, he's been with us for 6 years now. Scott froze. 6 years that didn't fit with what he had assumed about Charlie's pastas. They flipped through the album Hanidus. Charlie's collar, in one of the older photos, something about it stood out. Has he always had this collar, Scotist? Jane frowned slightly, thinking back. Yeah. Hey, a Scott's curious-eyed. Do you remember anyone who might have owned him before? Jane shook her head. No, we never knew where he came from before my dad found him. They continued turning pages until a particular photo caught Scott's attention. It was older and unlike Charlie's current tag, which was scratched and worn. The name on this one was still perfect legible. Scott's heart raced. This was a clue. Can I borrow this? It might help me figure something out. Hissed. Jane hesitated for a moment, then nodded, trusting Scott. With the photo back at the clinic, Scott spread the picture on the counter in front of Vima and Yara. "Look at this Emily Harrington," he pointed it out. A quick online search revealed woman by that name living in a nearby town. The timeline fit perfectly. Scott's pulse quickened as Hetty old her number. "I might have found your lost Kath," explained carefully, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation as, "If you ain't entirely sure how she would react." Emily blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a long moment she simply listened, searching his voice for any sign that this was a misunderstanding or some kind of cruel joke. But his tone remained sincere. You think you found Charlie," she finally whispered. Her voice barely above a breath. Scott nodded. "I believe so. Would you be willing to come to the clinic and see for yourself?" Still dazed, Emily managed a small nod. Couldn't find the right words, but knew there was only one answer. Yes, of course. The drive to the clinic felt surreal. Her mind flashed back to the day she'd lost him, the countless flyers she'd put up, and the pain that had never truly faded. She had tried to move forward, tried to accept that he was going, but now there was hope. When she arrived, Scott led her down the quiet way toward the kennels, his footsteps measured and deliberate. The scent, fantaseptic and faint traces of enamel fur, filled the air, grounding her in themament. Her pulse quickened as they stopped in front of a small enclosure. Scott gestured gently. "He's in there inside the kennel." A gray tabby sat curled in a tight ball, his green eyes way and entrusting. At first Charlie yowled a sharp defensive cry, the kind she had heard so many times before. When he felt cornered or uncertain, Emily's breath caught in her throat. That sound, it was so familiar. Scott stepped aside, allowing her to move closer. Charlie froze mid-yow, his ears twitched for forward, his pupils dilating as he took in her face. Emily hesitated, felt a lump forming in her throat, a mix of anticipation and fear. What if he hadn't recognized her? What if too much time had passed? Slowly, cautiously, she extended her hand, palm open, giving him the chance to come to her on his own terms. His whiskers twitching, a long silent moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Then suddenly something shifted. His tail flicked, his posture changed, and a depper rumbled from Hishus. Emily barely had a moment to react before Charlie leaned in, pressing his forehead against her palm and rubbing against her with clear affection. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Tears welled in her eyes. "I lost him 6 years ago during a move," she choked out. "I searched everywhere, but he was just gone." Scott watched quietly as she ran her fingers through Charlie's fur, her top light, but reverent, as though sure afraid this moment might vanish like a dream. The depth of their bond was undeniable. But just as the room settled into the warmth of reunion, the sound off steps broke the moment. Yara, the clinic's assistant, appeared in the doorway, her expression tense. "Scott," she murmured hesitantly. "Grace Carter is here." Scott turned to face her Grace, his brows furrowed. Yara nodded, glancing between him and Emily. "She looks upset." Scott exhaled sharply and exchanged a glance with Emily before giving her a reassuring "no deal, be right back." He stepped into the lobby where Grace Carter stood near the front desk, her hands clasped tightly, her face lined with age, carried an expression of grief and duncer. Tainty for a moment there was silence. "I heard you found a cat," Grace finally said, her voice steady but fragile. Scott nodded. "Yes, we did." Grace swallowed hearties. Is it Charlie?" Emily had followed, quietly standing just behind Scott. As she stepped forward, her gaze met Grace's hands. A something unspoken passed between them. The conversation that followed was difficult at first, both women holding on to their own pain, their own truths. Emily spoke of the heartbreak of losing Charlie, of the months and years spent searching for him, never fully oblado, except that he was gone. Grace listened, her finger tightening around the strap of her Persephone, in a quiet voice. She shared her side of the story, how she and her late husband had found Charlie wandering, how he had nursed him back to health, and how over time had become part of their family. As they talked, the tension between them slowly eased. There was no blame, no anger, only love for the same cat. Their stories wove together in a Wenether had expected, forming a bridge off understanding after a long pause. Seeks Haladsally. "I suppose he's always had 2 families, hasn't he?" Emily blinked at Herthan. Slowly she nodded. "Yes. I think he has. And so Aftermath thought they came to a decision on that neither had anticipated, but Beth felt was right. Charlie would have a 12 homes to families and all the love had ever known. Scott observed as their agreement a deep sense fulfillment washing over him. Charlie's journey had come full circle. Sometimes love wasn't a boochuzin. Sometimes it was about sharing. Did you enjoy this story? Do you also agree with the final decision to share Charlotte? Know in the comments below if you like the story. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a like. Sharing love for an animal is a wonderful thing. Do you agree? Thank you so much for listening. See we in the next video. Have a great day.